Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our 18th Real Business of Wine webcast. And again, every time we start this, I say we're doing it differently because they are all different and we're really making this up as we go along. We have been since the beginning. Polly Hammond, my partner in crime from the beginning of this project, which we started literally just at the beginning of the COVID lockdown. And we decided that tonight we'd like to do something with the ARENI Institute, which is something that started by a lady called Nicole Rollet, who you'll meet in a minute, who I've known for many years, and who is one of the most proactive people in the wine world. But Nicole will describe a little bit what she does, but I'll tell you that when I first met her, she started something called the Grenache Symposium, and the idea of pushing the idea of Grenache, because she loves Grenache and I love Grenache, and I took part in that at her winery in France, and we've been in touch ever since. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Pauline Vicar works with Nicole, and we'll hear a little bit from her. Francis Perrin from Saint Michel in the west coast of the US, and Amber Lebeau, who's one of the most talented of the new wave of online communicators under the Amber Spitbucket handle on Twitter, but also with a very successful blog, and one of the people I absolutely follow. And tonight, Polly is going to be there also at the controls, but in theory, the moderation is going to be by Nicole and myself. And Pauline, Francis, and Amber, and I think we have 50 plus participants. What we're hoping to have is a lot, even more conversation than usual. And we're talking, our main theme tonight is all about how producers of wine everywhere, and producers of all kinds of wine, actually communicate better with consumers than maybe we've done in the past. The board beside me, the background to me, refers to the fine wine consumer, because that's really, ARENI has a background of looking at fine wine rather than the lower end of the price scale. But we're talking about all wines tonight, and we're talking about who the people are going to be, who are the consumers of the future of every segment of wine, and how do we communicate with each of those segments. So I'd now like to hand over to Nicole to add her perspective to what we're doing. Nicole.
Thank you, Robert. I have to say that our friendship goes back to the most scary moment of my whole life, which was presenting our first wines to the international wine community many years ago. And it's been an inspiration to work with you through the years, and you're always a step ahead of everyone. And now with Polly, you've created such a great platform. So yes, my preoccupation has come from not just the fine wine world, but also the small winery world. And I've been very interested in trying to think about what that future could be. And that led us to creating Fine Minds for Fine Wines, and then meeting Pauline, who did an amazing job with that and has now created the ARENI Global Institute for the Future of Fine Wine. I do have a specific angle to my selfish interest, which is to see how fine wine producers are affected by these changes. But of course, a lot of that intersects with everything everybody else is going to be talking about tonight.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you everybody for being here tonight. I just wanted to jump in and very quickly explain to the audience and the participants a tiny bit of a shift in the programming tonight, and also give a little bit of warning. Zoom in the UK is having problems with their connection. If at any point we lose Robert and Nicole, I'm certain that they'll figure out and they'll pop in, but we'll keep rolling. The camera doesn't stop. So one of our goals in formulating this tonight is that we've done wine writers, we've done wine news, we've done editors, we've done, regions. We have a lot of conversations within our bubble. And that's wonderful and very appropriate. But when it comes to talking to the consumer, we have a consistent problem, which is many small independent wineries struggle to get out there and actually ask questions of their consumer and get the answers that they need from the right source. We like to ask around our own little echo chamber. So tonight we're shifting the focus from the audience being the question askers, which is where they sit with us, to tonight, helping answer the questions and give us your insights. So all of our attendees and participants, and I see we've got over 50 of them right now, as the conversations are rolling, please jump into the chat box, please raise your hands. We would like for winemakers who watch this live tonight or on YouTube over the coming weeks and months to actually walk away more comfortable with using direct communications with their consumer to answer the questions they need to make better decisions for their business. So with that in mind, now I'm going to pass the ball over to Pauline, who is the CEO or managing director, depending upon which language you use, continent to continent, of ARENI Global. She's here with us tonight on the panel, just like I am, because she sits very much in the research space where she's gathering the views from many participants within, in her case, the fine wine community, and she's going to bring some of those insights to us tonight. After Pauline, we're going to then pass back to Robert, and we're going to start with Robert and Nicole, and we're going to start with some of their questions about how, as independent winery owners, they can solve some of the problems that may have arisen with the change in consumer communications in this year based on everything that's happened. So Pauline, do you want to tell us a little bit about ARENI and the research that you do?
Yes, thank you very much, Polly and Robert. I'm very glad that we have the opportunity to collaborate on this topic because it's really at the base of what ARENI does. ARENI is a global research and action institute that, thrive to inform, inspire, and empower everyone who's invested in the future of fine wine. So, from producers to wine merchants to retailers to consumers, of course. And we've had the opportunity to do a big research on the fine wine consumer and its evolving behavior in collaboration with Ms. Treza, who's a negociant in Bordeaux. And we've been studying this over the last 6 months, presenting in Bordeaux for the first time in December. And one of the things that I can say straight away is that all the change that we've been seeing for the last months are not really new. Like what COVID-19 has been changing is the pace of change, but the change within the consumer mindset and the change within the consumer behavior has, it started to shift before the crisis that we are in, and the crisis that we're in is like accelerating everything. I'm a millennial myself. Polly describes me as the least millennials of millennials, which I think is very relevant when we talk about millennials, because I'm not really sure we can, it's a very big cohort. I'm sure Amber will speak about this after that, but it's a very big cohort, and there's so many behaviors within that. We'll have the occasion to talk about this later. As Robert and Polly said, we very much focus on the fine wine. We've got loads of information about what is fine wine within our website, but maybe when I'll be talking about fine wine tonight, if we can just, we mainly start at a 30 euro price seller when we talk in European language, and then above 450 euros and above, and all those crazy price fine wine. And I think it's just, when we look at consumer behavior, it's interesting to see that whether it's fine wine or not, consumers share a lot of behaviors regardless of the price point. And then of course the wine that they're going to access or the exclusivity of the relationship that they are going to want is going to change slightly, within the price range, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
I'm wondering if we've lost Robert temporarily.
No, we
there.
haven't. We had a slight moment there. So I'm going to come back. I'm going to throw the ball straight back at you, Pauline, and Amber on this question of boomers, millennials, and in fact the other generations we're talking about, because we've seen stuff recently from the Silicon Valley report and various other reports that are questioning which wines each group is actually buying. We've been hearing that the millennials are going to be the whole new buyer wine, but globally, we're not seeing them necessarily moving into fine wine, definitely, but a lot of them seem to be actually sidestepping wine completely. And we're seeing that as much in the US, where we've got cannabis and other competitors, but we're seeing it in France, where, and I'd be interested to hear Francis's view, because you see both sides of that picture, I think. And Amber, you're based there. We're seeing an awful lot of not just 25-year-olds who aren't drinking wine. We're seeing 35-year-olds and 45-year-olds who are not drinking wine or not drinking wine very much. So actually, can I throw the ball at you, Amber, on that?
Sure. I mean, definitely we are a very large cohort, but we're very different from both ends. I mean, I'm part of the old millennial groups. I mean, we're about to enter our 40s. But yet the youngest members of our generation are still in college. So it is hard to paint us with a broad brush. But you are right, Robert, in that we aren't adopting wine in the same way, partly because I think we're so aware of all our other options. I mean, you mentioned cannabis, and I would probably be remiss for my American friends, happy 420 Day. But there's all the other options, like, cocktails are huge. One of the things that surprised me most since I moved from the US to Paris was how much millennials my age in Paris at Apéro are drinking cocktails or beer more than wine. I mean, I'm in France. I expected more wine, but that's taken a lot. And then of course we see also in the US things like hard seltzer coming about, and just about anything that we could drink. I mean, to be kind of blunt, we're a little bit of slutty boozers. We're not really loyal to any one category, and that's unfortunate reality for a lot of wine producers.
And can I just also add to that briefly? One of the things I keep hearing about, everything has to be natural and local and so on. And the people I hear saying that are sitting around drinking Aperol spritzers. And if they're not drinking hard seltzer, their friends are drinking hard seltzer. And there seems to be quite a big disconnect between what people are saying about, oh, it's all going to be natural and local, and what actually we're seeing on the shelves. Francis, commercially, from Saint Michel, because you cover a wide gamut of wines, how do you see that?
Absolutely. We have a very wide portfolio from $9 Washington cabs that are great values to $250 Stag Leap Wine Cellar cask iconic American wines. We feel definitely we need to do a better marketing job talking to millennials. They don't want to be talked the same way. What we're trying to do also is to go much more experiential and trying to meet consumers where they are. We're rethinking the winery experience, and I think with COVID-19, it's going to accelerate these efforts. When wineries and tasting rooms finally reopen, we have 10 tasting rooms across the US. We're going to try to make things much more fun, and we'll see what social distancing will do to all these efforts. But for sure, I think to be a little provocative right now, the tasting room experience is a little bit boring for millennials, and that's what we're hearing when we're talking to them.
I guess I'd love to follow up on that. When you say that you have to figure out how to talk to millennials, what do the millennials think about how they'd like to be talked to? How would you define the difference in how you'd like, or what platforms, or what makes you excited as a millennial?
For sure, we're lucky in the sense that we have the scale and that we're surrounded with technology giants in Seattle. But definitely we're heavying up on social media communication, developing new types of content, what we call more snackable content, and more of it. Not the same old stories. Typically, even our company would produce content for some of our brands, and that content would be the same for 2-3 years, whether it's winemakers talking about wine. And we're just trying to create, and we're in the process of this, a content factory internally where we can just feed our social networks with much more frequent and different formats.
Can you quickly, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You use the word snackable, which is a word that we use in marketing, but I don't know that it's a word that wineries actually think of and know what that means. So can you explain what you mean by snackable content?
To give you an example, when we feature winemakers, we used to do pretty big production. We would do this every 3 years. do some great content featuring them. I think this world is changing. You know, now we need to have the winemakers on social media maybe a couple times a month. And this is what we're seeing with COVID-19. We've had a few Instagram live events with some of our winemakers, and the engagement has been really positive. You know, people are asking questions, are interested. And it's all about, you need to do it in a very authentic way. And I think there's nothing more authentic than having a winemaker sharing his story.
So how do you make decisions? And I'd love it. I want Pauline to also jump in on this with her research. How does a brand make decisions about what kind of content? Because you're not going to be rolling out the same content for Stag's Leap as you are for your, you know, $9 per bottle wines. So what kind of research goes into that? Do you do testing? How do you do focus groups? What can wineries take away from that?
What we're trying to do is really define what we call the DNA or the personality of each brand really, really well. And then the reality is you need to empower people in the teams. You know, we have young people that are millennials themselves, and there's a risk element to it for marketing, where we used to control that message really tightly. And same thing, you know, I think the future, I think where we want to go at some point is having the people working in our testing rooms also being curators of content locally, near the tasting rooms in their community. We're not there yet, but this is where we're heading.
Could I hit the ball back at you, Francis, just for the sake of playing devil's advocate, and say that whilst we're talking about authenticity and winemakers, on another channel, as it were, we've got Bon Jovi and Brangelina bringing in huge audiences, and possibly larger audiences that any winemaker is likely to bring in. So, and they're talking possibly the same millennials that our winemakers are, or are they the same people? Do people watch Bon Jovi one evening and the winemaker of your Riesling on the next evening, or are they different people?
It's a good point. Tough one. You know, ideally you would need a rock star winemaker would be the ideal solution, I would say.
I think Jean-Charles Boisset is trying for it with his Instagram post. I've actually got Stanislav. We've got one or two people coming in from the audience. I'd like to ask Stanislav Novak, who's talking about Russia, to just give a little vision of what's happening there. Stanislav, can I call you in? Stanislav, are you there? I'm going to ask you a question for you if you're not there. Okay, Stanislav is saying, in Russia, everything's so dull, everything is stuck into European. Recently, I bought Schwarz Riesling, but trend in Russia right now, an exciting, nice offer of €5 for a glass of Grignolino. The millennial is more into beer than wine. I'm not a millennial, by the way. Thank you, Stanislav. So I supply wine. I'm selling wine in Russia, so I do. I know there is an interest in wine. I know that you can give really good wine events there, and it's quite a good market, but I do know that wine producers are struggling there. Polly, did you have somebody else you thought was I think you had a question that you wanted to bring in. Was there someone, Polly?
Yeah, could I jump in?
Yeah, I actually wanted Pauline to give some insights on that because she's done a lot of research on this.
Okay.
Yes, so what we've been seeing in terms of, again, looking more at the fine wine consumer, is that there's no such things as like age cohorts. Like for fine wine, it's really about the intent, regardless of how old you are. It seems like people have, you know, common behavior, whether they are like 35, 45, 70. And so we've been talking about a millennial mindset, because millennials, regardless of who they are, regardless of their large cohort, which is, by the way, very different in Europe than in the US in terms of size and in terms of proportion of the population. So we can't really compare both markets. But the millennial mindset goes through, you know, all age, and that would require more individuality, more purpose. So they need to find a reason to buy your wine, more transparency. And the big question that we've asked them as well is, do you need more sustainability? And you started touching on this with things being produced more naturally, and etc. So we see that intent is really more relevant when we talk about fine wine behavior and consumer buying behavior than actually age cohort, if that makes sense. So for a winemaker that would like to communicate better, I guess for him or her, that would the main question to answer is, why is the people buying my wine? And we've established 4 main reasons to buy fine wine, and that's across also every country, because at that level, you know, the richer you are, the more international you are, and the more global, again, behavior you will have across the globe. But basically, people are either passionate, so they will buy fine wine because they are so passionate about what you do. They will seek in every little details. They want to engage with you. Some of them are status seeker. So if you want to communicate with them, it's about prestige, it's about exclusivity, it's about really that one-to-one connection with them. Some of them are collectors. So, you know, you might want to add the value that the wine can take over the years. And the rest are just affluent people, and they just buy fine wine, you know, because they can afford to buy $100 bottle when I can afford a, you know, 12 pounds bottle. So they're like regular consumer with just more money, if that makes sense.
Can I just chip in quickly on the sustainable thing? Because we did a piece the other week with Luli Halstead of Wine Intelligence, and we talked about the fact that people say they want sustainability. They all say it. And in fact, Wine Intelligence did a report early last year saying sustainability was going to be the thing that was going to happen in 2019. And they'd asked consumers and the trade internationally. Now, I'm producing wine in France. Can I say that my inbox was bombarded with customers saying, where's your sustainability? What are you doing? And so on. I can't. Francis, can I ask you, as a very big winery, have the calls, taking the Nordic countries and maybe 1 or 2 other places out of the picture, have you seen a huge growth in demand for saying how sustainable are you at the consumer level?
Definitely, I think, and we feel this demand's going. It's still manageable. But it's going to increase. We're on a journey. I think. Funny enough, I think we're starting to dive into sustainability, and it's actually defining sustainability is the first challenge. I think we need third-party auditors. You can do it yourself. Every region, when you talk to people in Oregon versus Washington versus Napa versus, we all define it differently. So I think the first thing we're doing as a company is assessing, where are we today, and that alone has been a real challenge. And there's a lot of myths out there on what's sustainable versus what's really sustainable. This is an area of focus that we've integrated in our company strategy. It's a journey more than a final destination, to be frank with you, to be completely transparent. But it's something important to the consumers and to us as employees. I think more and more, even employees, they're asking questions, about sustainability of what we do, how we use water.
So
I'd like, yeah.
Pauline, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so we've established something that we call the sustainability dichotomy, because sustainability, and for us at ARENI, sustainability is very broad as a notion. So it's being sustainable for the environment, for the social, so people that produce and drink your wine, but also financially. And there was a question in the chat, is sustainability really a trend? Yes, I think so. But the trend is at different level, at different places. So trade is really, like all the interviews that we've done, trade do care about tea because it's a good angle to talk with the consumer. Consumers, when it comes to fine wine, they generally don't really talk about sustainability, and I would dare say they don't really care about sustainability, because for them, and that's what Luli was saying the other day, they don't realize that even fine wine could be made in a not sustainable way, because for them wine is natural, wine is organic, it's that you know, farmer in the field in that magical moment, and they don't see what can happen in the background, even at the, you know, highest level of price point. So all the fine wine consumers that we've interviewed, and we've interviewed people that are very, very high in the market power and buying power, they're like, yeah, we've heard about this. We're slightly changing the way we consume luxury, but it's still not the first thing that they will think about. They will still buy their fine wine that they like, the chateaus that they relate to. And if it's sustainable, if it's a plus, but they're not going to stop buying something because it hasn't been sustainably produced, which doesn't mean that producers shouldn't be producing sustainably, but, you know. So
can I just chip in? Lorenzo Bisconti just would like us to, would ask you to define what is your definition of fine wine when you're doing these sort of questionnaires, please?
So when we're doing, I'm going to take my notes. When we're doing this sites, we have to use a price definition, because otherwise we've worked on a definition of fine wine that you can find on the website, but we have to be quite quantitative about this. We've got 3 tiers. I'll write them down in the chat. But the first one is from 30 to 150 euros ex seller. So it's, I guess, price at wines that would retail in Europe around 50 euros, 50 pounds to 150, 200 euros, 200 pounds. And of course, the US market is different because wine is just more expensive in the US. The second tier is 150 to 450. Same thing, ex seller. And the last year is 450 plus. So that's all, you know, those 18,000 pounds case of wines, and, you know, even 500,000 pounds bottle of wine singly. So that's the definition that we take. And again, consumers do have relative common behavior, but then what really changes when you are at the, you know, 1% of the top billionaires of the world, they operate in a total different model and in a total different world than the rest of us, I'd say.
Holly, you had a question.
So we have some really good audience questions that I want to get to, but I actually want to focus on this for a minute because, Amber, you talk a lot about issues of what I would call ostensible sustainability. So today you were involved in a very big discussion about bottle weight, and this comes up all the time with consumers and with trade. And bottle weight is one of these, it's a marker. It's not representative of the broad spectrum of sustainability like Pauline's talking about, but it is sort of a consumer-facing effort that can be made, that we weigh up the pros and cons between prestige and consumer expectation and gravitas and sustainability. So can you tell me, because you drink amazing wines, as a consumer of wines, you know, across this price board, are you making decisions based on that bottle weight? Has it impacted your buying?
I'm not bringing a scale to the store with that, but it is something that just is starting to factor more. I mean, Francis was talking about, you know, sustainability is viewed as a journey, and that is a lot what wineries view it as. For consumers, sustainability is a conversation, and its impact on consumers depends on who else they're talking to. And admittedly, a little bit more, I'd say Generation Z is making more noise about it than necessarily millennials, but people are talking about it. I spent many years too on the retail floor, in the trenches, face-to-face with customers. And yes, not every customer, the first question out of their mouth, like Pauline said, you know, top of mind, being sustainable, but talking with them, if they're working with peers that are very environmentally concerned about other areas, they're going to start asking questions about, you know, is this formed or organically? How is this made? And yes, even bottle weight will come into it.
Thank you. Can I bring in Birte, who's a regular here? Birte, can you hear me?
Hi.
Yes. Hi, Birte.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hey.
Question.
Yes, the question was partly answered already, but I was wondering if the wine world is not suffering from old-fashioned storytelling, meaning that discussing a lot with vintners, they consider most of the time the work they do not as very sexy because they work in the field, they have dirty hands, but they have plenty of really interesting stories to tell. And most of these stories I don't see them so much in the communication around the wine. I more hear like the wine is tasting like this, like that, with very intimidating language used. It's less storytelling. There is a lot of storytelling because I know many journalists tell the stories about the wine, etc. But the regular consumer, is he reading this? And most of the time I got the impression when they go to the store, they are not invited by a story that is told. And I was wondering what your experiences is about that. How are you selling the wine? Are you making the storytelling? Is it, yes, because there's so many stories interesting out there, and I don't get the feeling they reach the consumer. When you look at the cocktail side, the storytelling is really sexy. And I think this is also partly why the younger people are so attracted to this type of products. Maybe for the beer, it's the same thing. The storytelling is quite young. And for wine, it's quite traditional. So yes, I was very interested about hearing your point of view on that.
Francis, you've got a lot of different brands. How does storytelling fit into that?
You know, typically the ideal story is somebody visiting our tasting room who gets the real story, you know, from scratch to finish. Unfortunately, it's a very small portion of our consumers who gets to get that full experience. So, you know, before COVID-19, we're actually still doing it, but we have the idea of opening more urban tasting rooms for some of our brands. We're going to open an urban tasting room in Portland, Oregon for our Oregon wines. Just, you know, so that people don't have to drive an hour and a half to experience our Oregon wines. It's going to be in the, you know, in the Pearl District of so that's one way we go about it, because you're right that we need share of mind to be able to tell that story. Mm-hmm. That's one of our challenge in this industry. I think the spirit industry, and I know coming from there, they have an army of spokespersons, which are bartenders and barmen.
Yeah, you know, they're young most of the time.
Yeah.
So that's something also to jump on this. So if you go back to the millennial mindset or to the millennial state of mind, purpose is very important for fine wine consumers, apart from those that are just rich and just buy wine like this. But so you have to, and that's a discussion that we had with Eric Asimov, is you have to switch from the how when you tell a story and focus on the why, to give them the reason why you wake up in the morning and do your wines. And one of the examples that I can quote is Toby Beckers. Toby Beckers is a winemaker in Australia. He started his winery a couple of years ago with his wife Emmanuelle and wanted to make fine wine straight away, do amazing Grenache straight away to compete with Chateauneuf. And one of the things he's done is like, what are the stories that our consumers want to hear about? And it just asked them. Mm-hmm. Every time you had a visit in a winery, every time, you know, you could send a form on the internet or have a conversation, it just asked them, those are the stories that I can tell you. So I can tell you about my dog. I can tell you about my wife being French and being trained in Chablis in Burgundy. I can tell you about, you know, how we make wine. What story do you want to hear? And he actually realized that people wanted to hear a story about people. And he changed his website based on that. And it changed, I know that we talked a lot about this with Polly, but it changed the winery's visuals from just the vineyards to vineyards with people in it, because that's what people want to hear about and to connect about. So that's a real easy example to do for everyone doing DTC and having a website. What are the stories that your consumers want to hear? Just ask them. You've got so much you don't even realize that you've got stories.
I'd like to say something about stories there. I'd like to pull in Nicole here for a second. Nicole, how do you feel about this and this whole story aspect?
I think for us, it's very pertinent because it's all about stories, it's all about sustainability, it's all about doing all these things right and hoping that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think as you're a small winery, the one thing that doesn't feature in any of this is time, or time and budget, shall we say. So you're coming out of your ears with authenticity, with stories, with everything that happened all day. It could all be a story. And then you meet this wall where you don't manage to have the platforms, the people, the dedicated marketing person, all that stuff to get your stories out. So I'd be very interested if you try to maybe bring back in the millennial and the technology and the snackable to know what you think small wineries can do to bridge the gap between all the stuff they want to say and how to get it to people, because everybody knows, everyone who follows your winery loves you and has already bought into everything. How do you get into the next group of people who would love to hear your stories but don't know that you exist?
So I'm just going to bring Andrew in on this because he actually has a question that that ties in so well to this issue of storytelling, and especially our small independent wineries and tone. So Andrew, would you ask your question? And then again, if anyone in the audience wants to jump in with their consumer experience answers, we invite you to do so.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay.
Right, so I'm a consultant winemaker currently based in Spain, but I've worked in a few places around the world. And I've worked for some big places, famous companies. And with the current idea about winemakers and viticulturists and other cogs in the machine having much more exposure, being able to tweet and have their own Instagram accounts and that kind of thing, I'm wondering, should they be given sort of liberty to actually tell the truth? The things that went wrong, like we tipped the grapes on the floor and the ferment got too hot. This one got a bit of Brett. I find when I go out that consumers actually love like the real story. But then, if you're a big firm, sometimes, you've got a sort of marketing department and stuff, and the message might not be the same. And as a consumer personally, when I read a really PC polished piece of marketing from a proper firm, I just find it a bit boring, and half the time I can't even really understand what they're trying to say because there's so little content, it's so airbrushed. I find that actual consumers actually like the real story, but I'm just wondering how much of a risk is that for large firms to allow those people to tell that story.
Yeah, I can jump in on this. The one thing, you just nailed it. People want to know the real story. A lot of storytelling coming from wineries that consumers see is just way too polished on it. I was very fascinated when Francis was talking about, how they did this 3-year plan and have the winemaker tell his story. Really, instead of thinking about his story, they should be thinking about their stories, plural. Not just the winemaker, who's picking the grapes, who also the consumers. Like when you're in the tasting room, doing an Instagram live with people that are enjoying your wine right there, that, they might not be polished. They might not, go with the message of the winery, but the underlying message that you should be pushing, especially again, going towards millennials and an American mindset, admittedly, is the message of this wine is made by real people. That authenticity we crave on that. So take off the polish, take off the veneer, show us that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go.
I just wanted to add, you can bring on people that makes the wine, but also people that sells the wine, and that's what I was saying in the chat, is that middlemen are key. I know that we want to cut the middleman. I know that we want to go direct. It's perfect to go direct, to tell your stories, but in so many markets, it's not possible to sell direct because you don't have the time. Regulations are terrible. And everything. So really also focus on the middleman that works with you to create value, and that value could be telling their stories or having them telling your stories, like working on that storytelling jointly, because they know their market often better than you do. They know what stories people want to hear, And I mean, it's also super interesting to know the stories of the sommelier in relation to the wine, of the wine merchant in relation to the wine, everything that creates human connection with the wine. I mean, bring in the whole ecosystem. You can tell the story about the winemaker, but why not about, your importer in the US or the sommelier in Asia?
Could I just chip in? I'm going to bring Francis back on this for a second. We wine people, we are so obsessed with ourselves. We're obsessed with the people who grow the grapes, who make the wine, and then we're obsessed with the people who sell the wine and the sommeliers and so on. I'm fascinated how well the spirits world does without me knowing anything about the man who blended the whiskey or made the vodka. I'm fascinated to know about how successful the cosmetics business, and you've been in both those businesses, Francis, seems to work, and what they do. And champagne arguably does exactly the same thing. They are far more interested in the stories of the consumers. And that, to me, the Instagram thread, it's not actually, here I am, the winemaker standing in my vineyard. It's people who have bought my wine, actually using my wine and enjoying it. And that seems to be a message that we as wine people tend to overlook. Now, I'm not sure if it's as relevant to the fine wine market as maybe it is to the lower strands. And that's a question that I'd throw out to the audience.
I mean,
Francis,
for me,
can I throw this to you? Can I just throw this to Francis a second, because of your background, both at Pernod Ricard and at Coty. So,
yeah. For sure, I think the wine industry should look. We're a little bit introverted, looking at ourselves very often. Even, if we go back to marketing to millennials, there's actually some small entrepreneurial wine companies that are reinventing wine clubs right now, doing it on social media. I'm thinking about, companies like Bright Cellars, who are, graduates from MIT, who are all data driven. We're lucky in the sense that as of today, they're not creating great wine. That's probably their flaw. But the way they're focused on the consumer, the way they're reaching out to consumers, they don't have a tasting room. They don't even have vineyards, and they're pretty successful marketing wines to millennials. I'm not sure millennials today want to be part of our traditional wine clubs. I think we need to reinvent those clubs. Maybe it's a new name and it's a new way to go about things. Those are experiments I think in the next few years at Saint Michel we're going to try on some of our brands.
So I think, Francis and Robert, you're both hitting on something that's really at the heart of all of this, certainly on the fine wine end, which is that tension that exists in the heart of what wine or fine wine is, which is, is it art or is it business? Is it self-expression that we share as artists and hope that our incredibly personal perception of the world and interpretation of nature is going to resonate with our consumer, and we're going to find that miraculous little intersection between all our values and the things we stand for and the things that resonate with them? Or are we going to the other end of the spectrum and we're building our product all the way back to consumers and we're saying, oh, everybody seems to be preferring low alcohol wine or strawberry flavored things or more oaky or less oaky, so let's construct something to make that consumer happy based on the feedback that we're getting today from them. And so I think that as a winemaker, big or small, that's probably one of the very first questions you have to ask yourself when you're making that roadmap about what kind of wine you want to make and who you want to be when you grow up. So I think it's so dangerous to get all excited about data at the expense of getting to know your vineyard and thinking what's in there, and vice versa. If you're completely self-absorbed, you're not going to get anywhere either. So, how do you solve for that? I mean, both of you have to make lots of winemaking decisions or feed information back to the people who do. What would you, where do you see yourselves on that spectrum, and what would Amber or the people that Pauline talks to, or even Polly, think is the right place to put yourselves on that spectrum?
I'd like to bring Jean Taylor, if Jean is happy to talk. I'll see if I can pull her into the, I'm assuming it's Jean rather than Jean. Here we are. You've made a couple of very interesting questions in the audience, in the chat, about the language and how we actually talk about wine. We're talking about stories, but how do we express those stories? Jean, do you want to ask your questions? Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. It's just, I've been in wine retail for 12 years, and I've 13 years now, actually. And one of the things I found is that as millennials become more forward in their shopping and are just, they're a lot more I won't say it, for lack of a better description, in your face. They're very direct. So using our language that we learn as we train to become sommeliers and wine experts is often seen as being patronizing, and it really doesn't engage that consumer. They want real life stories. They want to hear where the wine came from. When I have a great story to tell about a local producer, how they got started, for example, a great winery out in BC that got started because they had been selling their grapes to a winery that was winning awards with their grapes. And so they were like, well, why can't we do that? And so they went out and found somebody to teach them how to make wine, and now they're winning awards. That kind of thing. I find that I'm far more successful in engaging that consumer and getting them to buy that wine and try that wine, far more than if I were to say, oh, the lovely aromas of blackberry and bramble and a little bit of dusty boot. They find that very patronizing for the most part. That speaks certainly to my older consumers who, are 50, 60, 70, but certainly not to the 30 and 40-year-old. And I think that's really key. I think we all need to think about that and think about how we have to find a new language to reach out and connect with these consumers in order to keep them engaged and bring them into our industry. We have to make it fun again, and not something that it was stodgy men and women in diamonds and tiaras and furs and smoking jackets in lounges.
Thanks for that. Pauline, you've got a comment there to add to that, or some insight.
I'd say yes and no. I mean, storytelling is great, and I, for one, love a good story. But again, it really depends on intent. When we speak about this, we also need to consider the consumers that are here to buy wine, just to buy wine as a product, and regardless of the price point, again, because people do buy fine wine without caring about what they're buying. I know that it's difficult for us to hear because we care so much, but there's a lot of affluent people that do buy fine wine the same way that people would buy wine in the supermarket. So those people are not that into the stories that much. And of course, the one that are passionate or status seekers, they will be involved with those stories because they need that as a personal interest, also to show off in a way. We've asked the consumers, so again, fine wine consumers, so more the wealthy part of the population, why and how they use internet and what type of information they looked for on internet. And we've got 3 different profiles. We've got the Western, all ages. So again, whatever the age cohort, what do you look for? What do you use internet for when searching fine wine? They use it for wine reviews and check prices and ratings. So they still need very, straightforward information about the price. Am I making, is it a good value? Are the critics happy about this wines? The younger internationals, so that would be the millennials and all the youngsters against this, they're totally into that. They use internet to learn about wineries and winemakers. And what we've learned from our fine wine consumers and fine wine merchants in China is that people in China, and notably mainland China, use internet to check if the winery really exists. So we are, there are still people that wants to go on your website to make sure that they are not buying a wine that doesn't exist anywhere or is just purely counterfeit. So stories is good, and depending on who you want to target, you'll tell a different stories, but don't forget about also all those information that will help different people buy your wine.
So can I jump in on this really quickly? because we've had so much goodness happening in the chat. I'm sorry I can't bring everyone in on this. One of the questions that we were asked earlier is, what do we do if we have multiple personas to whom we are talking? How do we gather the information we need so that we can use maybe it's appropriate channels or the right messaging in order to speak to both Gen Z, who's just now starting to buy wine, but also, you know, an older millennial, a Gen X, as Reka pointed out, we're not talking about Gen X at all, and we are all buying wine, and a boomer who they demonstrate similar behaviors, but in terms of life cycle of adoption, they are at very different points. So how do we market to different consumers at the same time? Anyone can jump in on that.
I can start. Oh, sorry.
Well, I'd like to make this even worse, Polly, because I think we're also actually, and we had this conversation slightly with Lily Halstead. At the moment, I'm wearing jeans. If you take a photograph of me in my shirt, you say, he's a guy who wears jeans. Tomorrow, I might be wearing a suit. I do different things on different days. It's a story I love to tell. I was in Shanghai in a top bar at the top of a building, and there was the Dom Perignon bar. And I wasn't in there. There was a rope, and there were a lot of very wealthy, older, mostly Chinese men with young women that they were never going to be married to, and enjoying a lot of Dom Perignon with sparklers and so on. And nobody was caring about the vintage or the great blend or anything else. On the same night in the same city, Richard Geoffroy was at the top of the Grand Hyatt giving a tasting of different vintages of Dom Perignon, talking about those things. I honestly believe that some of the people who were in the bar where I was might, on a different evening, have been listening to Richard Geoffroy, and vice versa. And I think that one of the things we are not very good at is understanding that people are multifaceted. So we've got different kinds of millennials, and we've got and different kinds of boomers, but we've got within that people who are actually in a different mindset on different occasions. And the clever brands, and that's why I think Dom Perignon has been such a brilliant brand, are actually there to say, what mood are you in? We will supply the product you want for that mood, and it'll be the same product. So sometimes maybe I want a story about the winemaker and the vineyards, but sometimes maybe it is Bon Jovi, or it's Brangelina, and it's that kind of glamour that I want for my wine. That's totally a personal view.
So again, I will push the middleman and the people that can tell you stories, because they will tell it in a different way, a different audience. Which one of the online roundtables that we've done about COVID-19 was about this, and I can quote because I've asked him. Marc Almer, who's the best sommelier in the world, 2019. What he actually said, the question was, how do you see sommelier evolving? Like, you can't work at the moment, so what's your role? And his role for him was to act as a middleman for wineries and for consumers alike as well. Because when you're doing webinars, when you're doing Zoom, when you're doing live tasting, I'm sure we're going to talk about live tasting later, but having someone who's neutral and who's also here to translate all the noise from all the wineries, for everyone going direct and suddenly, you know, putting their stories out there, as we're seeing now. Having someone like Mark that can translate that into the language of his customer now, those ones in the suits or in the jeans, and, you know, do that type of curation. So one of the advice he gave us is like, for small wineries mostly, because of the lack of resources, of time, and, you know, maybe you're not really used to tell your story alone, focus on different ambassadors or middlemen, however you want to call them, that speaks different language, that speaks to different channels, and that speaks in different countries, and work with them, because you can't tell your story to everyone around the world. I mean, people like Nicole has been very successful in doing so, but it's more the exception than the rules. So choose who will be your ambassador.
I've got a question from Leslie Howard, and I don't know what that question is. Leslie, nice picture of a cat I can see. Leslie, I'm just trying to unmute you. I'm very struggling to get your sound working. Leslie, I'm going to, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take you off. If I can't get your sound working, I'm sorry. I'll have to bring you down. Please write.
Can I ask Leslie's questions? Because
Have you got Leslie's question? No, I can't see it. So
I have Leslie's questions. So let me ask those.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we are talking about the consumer. So one of them was, what role will the traditional, small, independently owned neighborhood wine shop have in guiding? And this says millennials, Gen Z, but let's just say all our customer cohorts to the wineries. And I think this is a really important question because, of course, consumer behavior has just had a radical shift with the wine industry. So, you know, let's say in the future, post-COVID, how do we see the relationship between our independent local bottle shops and the consumers? And that's to anyone. Amber?
Yeah, I'm personally really worried about a lot of local wine shops because of the shift right now. I mean, I'm buying a lot of my wine from Amazon and online retailers that will ship to me, not my local shop down the road. And that's probably similar in a lot of atmosphere. And so for local wine shops, you know, I keep looking at social media. It's like some of the old shops I used to went at, you know, in Seattle and in Missouri, and I'm not seeing them being really active. So that is a fear with how COVID's going to change with the local shop. But potentially those independent shops, I mean, they have the immense power to reach consumers and tell those stories, to be the middleman that Pauline has been talking about as being so important for wineries. And a lot of wineries, I don't think, focus as much on how influential those middlemen, those indie shops are to telling their stories. I mean, when I worked on the retail floor for years, I can probably think of, off the top of my head, over like 7 years in one place, maybe only like 24 wineries actually like coming into the store to actively talk to us, to share their stories. Most of the time they just drop off tech notes and that's it.
Do you think that they can use technology now to reach out? Because a lot of the questions that we get is, what do we do if we're export wineries? Now we're being told we can't travel, nobody's going to fly. We are not able to walk into your store and rally you to our you know, side of things. Do you think that there is a space, really, not the bullshit version, to use video discussions, messaging, immersive experiences to bring those middlemen or even the gatekeepers, you know, our SOMs to our side for the customer?
Most definitely. I mean, going back to Washington State, the Washington State Wine Commission always just do this fabulous event every year, the road trip. That was always really well executed, where they would get the gatekeepers, the sommeliers, the retail stewards working in the trenches, and give them more behind the scenes access to the vineyards and the winery. Sure, a lot of it was scripted and you could tell some of where the BS was slipping in, but there was those moments where you would have like lunch and with one of the assistant winemakers there drinking their wine and not spitting, and start sharing a little bit more of those interesting stories that you could take back to the floor. You kind of got a really aspect of this person as an individual, and that took them from just being, okay, here's Columbia Crest, here's, you know, Three Rivers Winery. Here's somebody that's authentic. And if I can bring that authenticity and that passion with me to the floor, if I'm genuinely excited to sell your wine, that's going to translate more to the consumer. I'm doing that middleman job that, again, as Pauline's been saying repeatedly, and she's 100% spot on, is so valuable.
And I just, again, what would scare me if I was a small independent is to look at the Amazon model of books, because Amazon opens a three-dimensional bricks and mortar bookshop, but it doesn't look like a normal bookshop. If Amazon to clever modern distribution, the fact that if I'm in Japan, Amazon has sommeliers. I can phone up an Amazon sommelier who gives me advice. There's no reason why an Amazon type organization can't run online tastings, can't bring in three-dimensional VR relationships with their winemakers and so on. They've got the muscle to do that. So any small wine retailer is going to have to be a lot better than they've been before now. They can't just open their doors and say, I've got bottles of wine to buy. I think the bigger retailers have got the muscle to start actually biting into a lot more of that market.
Well, I think Nicole has a question about this, actually. So let's, Nicole, your question?
Yeah, I guess listening to all of you, it's sort of trying to put together the advice about segmenting the message, and then this idea that there are these people, whether they're the sommeliers, the independent wine shops, the new wine concierges that are going to show up in Amazon in the future. But if we are being told that we are supposed to do all this D2C and build all our database to know everything about our clients and talk to them and all that, how do you suggest that we use technology as a way to try to do that ourselves in support of whatever D2C we're trying to do, and still, of course, let the sommeliers and the other middlemen do their job? What would you recommend as a strategy for that?
I think, Polly, you should answer that.
It's funny, I was actually going to pass that one over to Frances, because I think that there are a lot of questions that independent wineries can learn from looking at, you know, our big brothers in this sense. They're solving these questions for us. So Frances, you know, what are the technologies that you see greater adoption of, that maybe you're suddenly refactoring into your marketing and communication strategies at St. Michel? And are these things that independent wineries can embrace as well?
You know, it's one of the funny thing in our portfolio, because we have big brands, but we also have small estates that are more like family-owned companies who are fighting internally for resources. So we're faced with the same challenges. You know, we've got small wineries in Washington that create luxury wines, who are, you know, it's a handful of people, and what I'm trying to do is allocate some of our corporate resources to these people to create content and to help them. But at the end of the day, you know, one of the things we're saying internally, we have to behave a little bit like wine entrepreneurs on all of our estates. So that's one thing I want to say, you know, that we're facing some of the same issues on some of our brands. Then as a company, for sure, we're investing now to what we call future-proof our business. So we are investing heavily in technology in our tasting rooms to get access to know our consumers better. You know, we're finding out stuff that we didn't know before, that some of our club members are multi-club members in our different wineries. We would have known that. We would not have known that before, because we were using separate systems in all of them. We're breaking some of our rules in terms of cross-selling some of our brands more than before. We used to be very, you know, every one of our brands owned that consumers, and right now we're introducing some of our sister brands. At Chateau Saint Michel, we'll feature some Oregon wines when it's the right time. So I'm not telling you we've got the solution, but we're breaking some of our rules from the past, where we're experimenting with new things. You know, packaging formats. You know, Saint Michel would have never done canned wines before, or aluminum bottles. We're launching some of these formats and testing it small scale, so that we're addressing some of the different occasions. And you know, it's still premiumization. When you look at it, these products are expensive, and of course it's not on our luxury products, but we're launching this summer you know, Saint Michel in an aluminum bottle, which is sustainable, portable. We're addressing new occasions, and if you look at it per liter, it's still it's an expensive proposition for a millennial.
Thanks.
We're taking risks and testing things.
Amber, were you raising your hand there?
Yeah, I'll tell you one incredibly simple thing that any small winery can do that will pay huge dividends. It's not going to require a lot of investments. Pay attention to your tags on social media. When somebody on Twitter, when somebody on Instagram tags your winery, hey, I've had this wine, I like this. Answer it. Pay attention to those tags, and don't just give a cookie cutter, you know, oh, we're glad you like the wine. You know, maybe just take a peek at what they actually said in there, or what they actually had in the photo, where they pairing it with something, and just answer it like a person. That such an immense impact to have this wine that you absolutely love you back in just a small little way.
And in those times of winemakers being superstar, it counts even more. And what I wanted to say when we talk about technology is that for loads of small wineries, and even in the fine wine world, one of the technology they have to invest in is Excel and just a spreadsheet, because we talk about all those fancy technology like AI and VR and everything. But so many small wineries don't have either an Excel spreadsheet for their own database as customer or an Excel spreadsheet to run their numbers properly. That's why we also have so much problem in the money part of the sustainability. So before, you know, there's loads of things that are not so expensive that we need to get right before we can get to the level of, you know, having QR codes on bottles and all those sorts of things.
And I would say something very, very basic and simple that we found out during this crisis is with the boom of e-commerce, whether it's on our own e-commerce channels, on our retailers, just the attention to detail, having the right picture, the right description.
Yeah.
And we actually, that's the way we leverage some of our sales team who were at home. We did inventory of all of our e-commerce on our retailers. And we're in the process of fixing all that, making sure we have the right picture, the latest description. And I can tell you, we found out that some of it was just, and it's basic stuff, you know, making sure we talk about our wine properly. And we're seeing results, you know, out of these small efforts.
Can I jump in on this? Because this is something we deal with all the time. This is actually, when we use the language of listen to your customer and ask your customer questions, we often forget that in digital, there's a data component to this, and that we can actually use tech to ask questions like, are our pictures appropriate? Is our language appropriate? It's very easy to A/B test and to find out, and an A/B test is an ask, you know, and to find out what is working best for our particular customer. And that is, you know, Pauline talks about Excel, which I agree with entirely, but from a digital standpoint, making certain that you've laid that really strong foundation so that you can get those answers and make informed decisions in your presentation is often overlooked. So it's not always asking person to person.
Karen Jenkins raised the point that the British independents in Britain, certainly the top end, are doing a very good job in terms of delivery and really getting wine out there. But I've got a note from Laura Iverson in New York. Laura, would you like to say what you were saying? Laura, are you there? I'm going to... yes.
Would you like for me to...
Yeah, go and say what you were saying. You were talking about how the best indie distributors or retailers are being very dynamic in New York, which is, of course, a great place to be an independent retailer.
Right. We were just talking earlier about, you know, how retail is faring right now. And my observation, which I'm sorry I sent just to the panelists, not to all attendees, is just that from my perspective, both in urban New York and in suburban New York outside of the city, retail right now for wine is thriving in a way that I've never seen. I think that retailers have done an exceptional job of leveraging the relationships that they've built in their communities and the dialogue that they have with their customer base on an ongoing basis in terms of their customers' preferences and tastes. This dialogue eliminates the need for the customers to shop in store. They can simply call the retailer and say, you know what I like, you know, can you think of anything I haven't tried? They can place an order over the phone or through email. They can arrange for curbside pickup or same day delivery. And they're really being able to enjoy the new opportunity to really focus on the consumption of wine in their homes. With the absence of obviously the entire hospitality industry right now. My local neighborhood shop told me last week that twice since the COVID quarantine has begun in New York, he has doubled his all-time single-day sales records, which historically have always been New Year's Eves, because he just, you know, news comes out that certain businesses are going to be restricted, et cetera. People sort of panic, for maybe to use a slightly strong word, and go place a big order. So he's doing really well. And I think that that is encouraging to see that while so many parts of the wine industry are struggling right now, local retail in many places is thriving.
Thank you, Laura. Can I just also chip in? There's something just Pauline, just before I forget this. It's just picking up on something Laura said. We do now have restaurants who are getting into distributing fine wine on a retail essentially basis, if you like, in a way that they weren't doing. Because people are drinking fine wine at home that was recommended by a sommelier, but not in the restaurant. And the question is whether that's a temporary COVID-19 situation or whether we're going to actually go on having that kind of relationship. We did a session, Polly and I did a session with the sommeliers right at the beginning of this, and they were talking very much, James Tidwell of Texon was saying that you've got a whole new set of activities by sommeliers who are now becoming essentially sort of wine retailers in a sense. I don't know how.
I think Nicole has an answer. Nicole has her hand up.
It's actually, I'm trying to do my job to speak on behalf of small wineries and ask how can big or small wineries support those initiatives? How can we reach out to those independent wine shops with proposals that are useful to them at this moment while they see their sales doubling? Of course, the middlemen will be hopefully doing their job to supply those shops or those sommeliers with the wines. But what do you recommend? Some have come to us and asked us to do live tastings and things like that. But is there something you would like to see small wineries or any wineries doing to help in that effort to feed people's attention while we have it?
So one of the quotes that I've put on the chat, and I think Polly's going to like it as well, is about community, which I think relates a lot to the corner shop and to independent retailer, as Laura was saying, and she used that word about, you know, the community of the retail shop. That community is much more than belonging to something. It's about doing something together that makes belonging matter. I know it's a bit cheesy, but I think it works quite well. And really involving your consumer in the retail. One of the things that we've seen in the roundtables as well, some of the wineries and some of the importers and some of the somms that we had around the table, when we asked them, what did you do? Like, what's the first thing that you've done with the COVID-19 and you stopped working? And they said, well, we literally phone everyone. We took the phone, we used all the resources that we couldn't use, you know, in the winery to do tours and etc. And they personally called their own clients to ask how they were doing first. And then, of course, if they needed something, they were here to sell. But that type of community, like, I'm making sure that you belonging to my community makes your time worth in that way. And when we've talked to importers, to answer your question, Nicole, the demands are really different because they also have very different staff, and the level of education and resources for the staffs are very different. So same thing, the importers and the wineries have communicated on a one-on-one basis, like, how can I help in that difficult time? Well, it depends. You can train my staff because they have nothing else to do at the moment than being trained. You can help me reach out for consumers. You can group an order with other fine winemakers so that we can send all the wines together. It really depends on the situation and again where you are.
Can I just want to ask a question from the audience. So Betsy, who is Acorn in Healdsburg, has a question that applies to this. And Nicole, I think this one may be for you. How do you convey the sense of, we need you to buy for us so that we can survive, along with, we want you to buy our wines because you love them and you want us to survive? So that is the community, it is the marketing, it's the storytelling, the whole thing. So kind of how do we start to bring this into a communication package that helps us get through all of the change, whatever they may be? It's COVID right now, it could be something else 6 months from now. Nicole, can we start with you and kind of work through?
Well, I think all of us have tried to figure out who's most in need right now, and the answer that's come back, of course, loud and strong, is the on-trade community, the restaurants and the sommeliers and the restaurant owners, but especially in the countries like the US that don't have the big safety nets and all of those things, and the help from the government and all of those things. So they as winemakers, the first thing you can do, obviously, is look out for those guys and reach out to them and just say, hey, do you need help? What can you do? Where are you? Are you looking for a job? somebody I spoke to couldn't get her through to the unemployment office, try to find someone who could help her out. And then the second thing, maybe considering making a donation to a hospitality charity of some kind. We found one in the US that was very reputable. Happy to share that information if anyone needs it. Same for the UK, etc. And then you start to think about your own, who's next in line for being in trouble. A couple of the small independent retailers struggling without an online presence, etc. For those people, that phone call that you're saying, that helpline, we set up a conference call once a week for those people to talk about their problems and try to pass on to them some ideas and solutions. And then finding out that some of those other retailers are actually doing very well, like the ones that were being described, and those people suddenly ask you, okay, what can we do for you commercially to support you? But then suddenly you start thinking, okay, well, who's next? Yikes. Look at those small wineries. Those small wineries are in potentially big trouble. They might make it through the next couple of months, but they won't be out of the woods, because suddenly the restaurants that survive will have stocks. They won't be reordering anytime soon. Some of them will have payment problems. Cash flow problems will be the beginning of small wineries problems, but then borrowing at very high rates. There are a lot of things coming down the pipeline right now that's going to make it really hard for small wineries to survive. So in that case, because you flip it around and you go back to your consumers and you say, hey, if you like small wineries, if you like our wines and you like our work and you believe in the craftsmanship and the sustainability and all the other stuff, drink small. Try to look out at parity of price or style or quality or variety. Why don't you look out for a smaller winery instead of a big one in the same category? Now, I don't know how the people here making bigger volume wines feel about that, but I hope you agree that the smaller ones are going to be more in trouble in the next period and will benefit from consumers looking out for them and buying their wines.
Yeah. I mean, I can answer Betsy from a consumer point of view, because everybody's asking for sales right now, and I can say the wineries that I have bought from during this time are ones that I've came across, like their Instagram live story where they're talking about kind of like not even asking for the sale, they're just kind of talking about what they're going through, what they're doing to keep staff busy, to keep staff. One mentioned that he sold some of his games, I guess Xbox games or whatever, to help kind of make ends meet. And so I went to his website to see if I could buy it. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it shipped to me, but I told several friends, hey, if you're in the California area, look at this guy's stuff on it. That personal connection, that humanity of seeing that, it triggers a little bit more of a response than just like a general, hey, let's support the wine industry. Here's what I'm going through, and if you can buy wine, buy it, it's great. If not, but also make your website easy to know if I can buy it from. That's been, unfortunately, sometimes go there and it's like, oh, I want to buy it. No, I can't.
That's a big problem with small wineries.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a big problem with the middlemen who don't share the information readily in terms of where the wines are available. Certainly, we're very lucky that in the US with Wilson Daniels, they're very well organized and we can access the information and we can then share it with clients who want to know. And that's true for a couple of our importers around the world, but generally speaking, we're not able to direct them to those resources unless the people are willing to give us the information.
One of the things that we've seen for small wineries and actually even larger wineries, but one of the discussions that we had, like how can we survive as a winemaker, the COVID-19, was a redefinition of fine wine on 2 points. For example, there's loads of wineries in the southern hemisphere that are bringing harvest at the moment, are bringing a new vintage in without the possibility to bottle the previous harvest, because they have no possibility or even not the right to bottle, because it's not a necessity like in South Africa. So we've discussed the possibility, those discussions started before, but they were not really taken seriously. Do fine wine needs to be vintage? Or can this year we could try having a premium top range blend of different vintage that, you know, was caused by the necessity, but could also start different conversation. And the other one was, and back to Nicole's comments, usually fine wine is about reds mostly, but rosés and whites do have a quicker turnover because you make them in faster usually. So one of the communication that we've seen or that we could consider in the conversation is like, you know, buy my whites and rosé now so that you can drink the reds later, and so I can have, you know, like support me in, if you want to drink the reds that you like so much. I mean, we're also making red, white and rosés. And Francis, I mean, Nicole's been talking about small wineries, but you as a big one, you're doing loads of stuff, like you taking all the small wineries of Washington State with you as well.
Yes,
sorry, I interrupt because I know Francis, great job, and Saint Michel, great job in their community.
For sure, within Washington, Saint Michel, we have a responsibility. You know, we've always helped our smaller wineries. When there were frost years, we would provide grapes to the smaller wineries in the past. And we have this that same sense of community right now. Our efforts are going towards the on-trade. We've just announced like donations to some local food banks and organizations for restaurant employees, because Nicole mentioned it, the social net in the US is difficult for some of these employees. And then, you know, of course, we're concerned about our own employees. That's why we're trying to keep people busy. We're having tasting room people make phone calls, and the response has been pretty fabulous. We've had our sales team, as I mentioned, focused on e-commerce, working as a team on our content on our different e-commerce channels. And you know what we're trying to do is also prepare for the future. I think you know, the e-commerce thing. I think consumers are going to take new habits right now. They are ordering wine online through e-commerce, and these numbers are quite impressive. While our on-trade business is almost to zero, so we want to make sure we set ourselves up for the future. So we're in a way investing in these channels right now heavily to both promote them but be ready for the future. We're testing, you know, penny shipping, things like that, free shipping, which we know shipping is one of the barriers to selling wine remotely.
I think we're just about heading for past, so I think it probably is time for us to wrap up. We're nearly half an hour over. I'd like to, I think the one thing that comes out of this, Polly and I were just actually just swapping notes off on the chat line. We've covered a lot of ground. I don't think anybody's going to walk away from this at the end having got a list of 3 or 4 answers, and I don't think there are 3 or 4 answers. I think different people are in different situations, whether they're wineries, they're independent, they're distributors or wholesalers. Everybody's in a different place. I think the one thing, I think, and somebody in the thread said to anybody who's not been using the internet, who's not been doing online selling, well, they're getting there late, and they may be too late. And anybody who's not been doing it very well is going to have to do it better. And anybody who's not watching what their competitors are doing is going to have to do that better. All of us are going to have to be a lot sharper. And I think that's going to be very tough on a lot of what I would call the lifestyle producers and indeed distributors, people who are in the wine business because they love it, and they're some of the most passionate and some of the best people we know, but they're not necessarily very good at running their businesses. And whilst we would all want to help them, actually even the professional people are going to need the help as well. So I think there's going to be a shake-up, and I would just, what Polly and I have been doing for the last, whatever it is, a month, is trying to get voices like these, and not just the voices you've heard, but also the voices on the chat. And I really recommend anybody read back across some of the comments that we made in the chat. There's a lot of information there, and I think we will just go on sharing it and picking the best bits out of it, because I think that the people who are best at it will survive and will indeed prosper. And we did a great session on Friday with a set of sommeliers, and they were so positive. We had Delynn Proctor, we had Andre Mack, and we had Gary Obligacion, and they were talking about how they were looking to the future. They were starting new things. And I think that the best of us should actually not be thinking about survival. We should be thinking how we grow out of it and think really optimistically, not just about how we scrape through. Because if we can think about growth, we may survive. If we think about survival, we may not achieve that. So I'm
Can I wrap up?
Positively, and I wish the best.
Can I wrap up with something
Yeah.
that I think we've heard so many times, and we heard it from everyone on the panel tonight, and I think Francis said it exactly this: we are breaking our own rules, and we are experimenting with new models, and we are open to change. And I've sat through the ARENI roundtables, and something that we heard time and again, and we've heard it here as well, is the language of, I've challenged my team or my staff to fill in the blank, like looking at it as there is this positive space that we can move into, but it means breaking all of the rules, experimenting, trying new things, learning, meeting our people where they're at. And so thank you all for bringing that to the table tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.